Welcome to another Tactical Fly Fisher on the Water tutorial. Today, it's the beginning of August, or in the first week of August, and as you can see in the river behind me, we don't have high summer flows anymore. It's low, it's clear-ish, and it's techie kind of late summer fishing conditions. A lot of times people refer to these as the dog days of summer. So here today are some tips I'm going to give you to help improve your success in these conditions when the fishing gets a little tough. I've got 6 tips here for you. I hope they help you out on the water and help you catch a few more fish. All right, so tip number 1, take a temperature. If you've read my book, Tactical Fly Fisher, there are lots of reasons to take a temperature when you're out on the water. Number 1, it helps you decide what type of water to fish. But in a late summer context, we just need to make sure that it's actually safe for you to be fishing and catching and releasing fish. We want to worry about the health of the fish first. So take that temperature, and we want to have that temperature be under, for sure, the 70-degree mark, but really the temperature, once it gets to 68 or 69 degrees, that's when you're looking at trout getting stressed, especially if you play them a little long. So if you can get temperatures below that, not only is the fishing going to be better because their metabolic rate's going to be higher and they're not going to be stressed, but then you don't have to worry as much about whether you're doing undue harm to the fish when you release them. So try and keep temperatures in the mid 60s and below if you can. If you go to a place and it's pushing 70, just pull the plug and try and find some place that's got a cold water input, like a Spring Creek or a tailwater, or just go higher up in the mountains to get some colder temperatures. And this morning, I already took a temperature and we're at 59 degrees, so at least for now, we're totally good. Maybe in the late afternoon, you might have to worry about it, but certainly we got 2/3 of a day where we probably have good fishing conditions. Okay, number 2, stay downstream of the fish and stay low if you have to move to the side. So all this water that's around me here, the deepest any of it gets is about my knee deep. It's very shallow, and in shallow water, fish are going to be spooky. It's also pretty smooth. It's not high raucous, high velocity, tons of turbulence type of water like you would get in here earlier in the summer when the fish aren't very spooky because you can get close and they don't even notice you really. In these conditions, they're going to spook. And it's funny, we just had 2 anglers that came fishing up below us, and when I was commenting on it, the first angler came and fished through, and his buddy walked right on his heels and was fishing exactly where his friend had just fished through. And there's no sense in that. You got to realize we have an impact on fish, and if you start walking through a river, you're going to spook them. So approach them in a way that you have the least chance of spooking them. And normally in conditions like this, that's from downstream, unless you're willing to crawl on your knees the whole time. So if you watch me fish in conditions like this, I'm usually at fishing upstream, or at least quartering upstream, and trying to stay behind the fish. Now those angles are a little bit tough if you're new to Euro nymphing. It can be tough to fish at those angles and get good presentations, so it's something you need to practice a lot so you can get good drifts if you're Euro nymphing to still catch fish. Number 3, this is a really important one. Fish tight to structure and in shade if you have it. Luckily, we're here early in the morning. We got a lot of shade right now, and this is a pretty tree-lined section of river. There's usually at least always one bank or the other that's got some shade on it. Those are good places to find fish in the late summer. If you got a boulder, don't just fish near the boulder, fish under that boulder. If you got a tree, I'm sure we'll find some trees and some logs up here soon. Fish under those trees, fish under that log. My teammate Pat Weiss, he is an absolute wizard at this. I watched him a couple years ago in Slovakia. We fished a stretch of river that had been fished by 4 or 5 other teams before us that day. The fish were absolutely scared out of their minds. And he took flies and actually put them under and jigged them under boulders in the river, and he actually got brown trout to come out from under them that had stashed themselves under it when they were scared out of their minds from all the other anglers. So if you can fish tight to structure or under it, you're going to catch more fish. Number 4, also look for fish in shallow broken riffles. And downstream of me and upstream of me, there's a lot of broken riffles that are only this deep. But in the summer, especially when the water temperatures are in the 60s, fish will be up in that all over the place. Those are good feeding lies. And even with the broken riffle to them, they can be decent holding lies if there aren't a lot of overhead predators, avian predators, things like that. And so you'll find a lot of fish in riffles. Don't skip them, and find ways to fish those. That's where a single fly or a dry fly presentation first is a really good way to go. It does not make sense to fish 2 flies in water like that. So typically in stretches of river like this, if I'm nymphing, I'm just going to be fishing 1 nymph, because a lot of times I'm fishing water that if I was fishing 2 flies, my dropper fly might as well be out of the water because it's just not deep enough to fish 2 flies and have it make a difference. So get used to fishing 1 fly in late summer low water conditions like this. And all right, number 5, you still need to fish shallow to deep. Now, what does that mean in the context of a river like this? Let me give you a quick example from this exact stretch of river. I was fishing here not too long ago, a couple weeks ago. The water was a little bit higher, but pretty similar. And I was fishing a deeper piece of water in the center, catching a lot of fish, but as I walked upriver, I could see fish on the banks as I went. And there was even one fish that was so shallow that occasionally it had his dorsal fin out of the water. They weren't taking dries all that well that day, so I still had to fish a nymph. And so I went to a single 2 millimeter fly for that fish, caught it right away. And then I went back to the center and fished a lot of that center water as I was going up with the 2 millimeter. Caught fish doing it, but there were still some deeper slots that I knew had fish further down in. So I went to a 2.3 millimeter bead on the same fly, caught some fish, and then even had a couple of spots where that wasn't quite enough, but if I went all the way to a 2.8, then it was too much. So instead I put on a 2.5 millimeter inverting bead for that fly. So especially if you're a fly tire, this is a really good time or section of type of water to be very precise in your weights, to have very small increments in between the weights in your flies. So for a lot of my flies that I use a lot, I might have a 2 millimeter bead, a 2.3 millimeter bead, a 2.5 millimeter inverting bead, a 2.8 millimeter slotted bead again, and then a 3 millimeter inverting bead, etc. So I get really small weight gaps in between flies that I can make a big difference in my sink rate in shallow water like this. It's how the fly comes to the fish as well as how it's dropping when it comes to the fish. If it's dropping too fast and it gets under it, doesn't matter, that fish doesn't see that fly. If it's staying way above them and never comes down, it's not getting it either. You want it coming at the fish, at their level, and not sinking like a rock when it does. And if you can get really precise with your weights, you're going to catch more fish. Along with that shallow to deep, don't be afraid to try that dry fly first. Get some heads up, or a dry dropper first before you go to that full nymph rig. Number 6, it is late summer, so there aren't many big bugs left around. There's the occasional caddis and the occasional PMD, the occasional late summer Baetis flying around right now, but in general, the big hatches of the big bugs of the year are pretty much over. So what's left in the river? Well, small nymphs. If you took a stomach pump sample right now, you'd find a lot of midge larvae, small Baetis nymphs. You might still find the occasional PMD nymph or caddis larva, things like that, but it's going to be a lot of small stuff. And so that's where small fly choices come in. Most of my flies that I'm fishing right now, especially in water like this, they're size 16 to 20, and really not over that. For one thing, I don't need anything with a lot of weight, so there's no point in going big. But also most of what the fish are feeding on this time of year is small. So even if you're still fishing an attractor style fly, try it small first and lightly weighted, and then go from there. If the small doesn't work after you've given it quite a bit of time, go for shock factor. Go to something like a mop or a squirmy or even a lightly weighted streamer. And a lot of times fish in the late summer, they can kind of just be not heavily on the feed, and so standard dead drifts and presentations with normal quote-unquote flies may not work very well. Or you might get a few fish that were the aggressors in a lie, but there might be several more that you can get by going back with a cleanup game with one of those shock factor flies. So I hope these 6 tips help you out on the river. Let's go and put it into practice, and we'll check back with you afterward. All right, I'm gonna creep up on this little pocket behind this rock here. I'm starting with a dry dropper rig I have a caddis dry, a little experimental CVC jobby with a 2.3 millimeter, just simple waltz worm below it. We'll see what happens. I've actually gone to the waltz worm here, not only because it works, but I don't want the faster sinking speed, for instance, of a perdigon. So that dubbed body on the waltz worm slows it down in its sink rate compared to a perdigon. A perdigon is great when I get to some deeper water or to some heavier water where I need extra sink, but in here I just don't need it. There we go, there's a fish. And one of those tips, remember, I can't remember which number now that I'm in the middle of this, but was to fish tight to structure, right? Well, I got that fish right over under those extended tree branches, not the ones that are on the water, but just above it. That fish feels nice and comfortable under that spot. Doesn't have to worry about predators too much. And thankfully he was there for me to pluck out with the nymph. Nice small fish to start the day. And you can see so far I'm staying downstream of wherever I'm fishing, behind the fish. That way I'm keeping behind their cone of vision in that little blind spot they have behind their head. And if you're having a hard time Euro nymphing and getting good drifts at that angle, which a lot of people will when they start out, you can either float the cider and try and keep it nice and still, or switch to a dry dropper rig, kind of like what I've got going here, and use that rig to smooth your drift out for you. There we go. So for this fish and for this entire last stretch of river here, I had a 2.3 millimeter bead on at first. Well, dropped that one. But I had a 2.3 millimeter bead on at first, and I was just ticking bottom too much. So I switched up to a 2 millimeter bead and a single nymph, and just picking my way along any little tiny depression within flats or riffles that I can find. This one had a double whammy if it had a rock for it to sit in front of. So it had a little cushion it could get in front of right there, but also some shade from that tree up above. So not surprising there was a fish there. Let's find another one.
Now you want to sway your hips and really make the whole motion fluid.
It's all in the hips.
I think Lefty Cree was the one who said it's the pelvis, if I'm not mistaken. The Elvis of the pelvis, I believe he was known. Sorry. Enough of this. This is serious. We're here for business.
There we go.
Yo.
So, nice broken riffle spot. Little rock above to block some current. And I went back to a 2.3 millimeter bead because the 2 mil wasn't quite enough. And there we have it. So right over here, there's that exposed rock just by the bank. And as I was walking up, looking in some of those seams over there, I saw some fins. So there's a fish right here. We're gonna go ahead and see if we can get it. I think I just saw him eat. Saw the little white wink. Hopefully he'll white wink for me. Spot on. Oops. Actually under him, I think. Oh. really. Okay. Let me go a little bit lighter. There we go.
Nice work.
Never mind. Just had to get the drift over another couple inches. He was sitting in a tight little seam that I apparently hadn't gotten close to him enough yet. Goes to show just how much water you're missing when you're blind fishing, or how many fish you're missing. Because I put a lot of casts through that spot before I got it to the exact spot where he was, because he wasn't willing to move. He was in some pretty heavy water, so there was no moving. Oh, sweet.
Excellent.
See you later, buddy. Gosh, that was way harder than it should have been. I've moved off the bank and there's some shallower and flatter water here, so I switched back to a 2mm bead. And we'll see how that goes. Whoop. And if you need to, you can always kind of give it a little tuck cast there. Pile up some slack if your first few drifts didn't slow down or tick bottom or hook a fish, and you think they should have. Pile up a little slack, let it drop for a half second, and it hits bottom like it just did there. Whereas if I make a cast and have it tight right off the bat, right from the beginning of the drift, then it's not going to sink as fast. So that's another way to go shallow to deep in that instance. There we go. So, well, I lost that fish, but let's just point out where I hooked it. So I have this pocket right here, and I had a fish come over and look at a fly right there real quick. And that's the one I was just switching flies for. Never to get him to eat again. But you can see that heavy water out beyond. And in warm temperatures, summertime conditions, that looks really fast, but there's often fish that'll stack up in places like that. And I caught that fish probably a foot out into that fast current right there in water that would look like it's just too fast. But he certainly was there to eat, and it's pretty often that I'll find multiple fish out of a place like that. So don't pass them by in the summer, especially with the single nymph. Let's see if I can maybe get a shot another out of there. There we go. Ooh, big whitefish. Gonna have to move for this one, I think. Maybe not. If you'll notice the angles I'm keeping with my rod, they're pretty much what I specified in that last fish fighting video we did a couple times ago. And there we go. Flies out. And back on its way. Let me talk really quickly about the fly progression that I went through in this spot, because I made a bunch of changes, all for a reason, and at least I ended up getting 2 fish out of it and missing a third. So when I first came up here, I had a 2.3mm slotted bead Perdigon on, and I flashed a fish in that pocket, and frankly I was too heavy for that pocket with that fly. That fly, even though it didn't have a lot of weight, just sinks really quickly with that Perdigon body. I should have switched before I hit that spot to a 2mm fly. And after that, I never got that fish to eat again, but to get a different drift, I went back to a 2mm waltz worm to have it sink slowly. Then I went to a 2.3 waltz worm to have it sink a little bit faster, but still not quite as fast as a Perdigon. Then when neither of those worked, I chucked on a mop just in case that fish would be willing to eat again. Didn't get him to eat. But when I went out to the fast water, there I knew that I needed a little bit more than either the 2.3mm Perdigon or either of the waltz worms, because it just wasn't going to sink fast enough. So I still have a single fly on, but I went to a 2.5mm inverting bead. Same Perdigon as what I had on before, but just a 2.5mm inverting bead, which weighs a little bit more than that 2.3mm. And I hooked 2 fish pretty quickly in succession in that fast water on that fly. And I don't think I would have needed any more than that. I still ticked bottom at the back end and caught or hooked 2 fish at the top end, so that amount of weight seemed about right. So when you're going through a spot like that, yeah, you can just fish 1 fly and probably catch fish if you chew up a lot of water. But if you really want to drill down into the specifics of a spot like that, it helps to go through progression and work yourself from shallow to deep, or from, you know, a slower sinking fly to a faster sinking fly, or just different types of flies. And going from a waltz worm that sinks slower to that Perdigon that sank a lot faster for the same weight ended up, you know, creating a few fish in there, and often does in similar spots. There we go. So back to that same spot where I caught the whitefish. Same fly. And this time we got a brown trout. But I did one thing a little bit different this time. I started animating my fly. Boy, he's going all over the place over here on the bank. So I started jigging my fly just ever so slightly as it came through. And that fish didn't eat on the first couple of dead drifts, but a quick little jiggy drift, and there he was. There we go.
Good job.
No.
Stick.
Well, sometimes when you fish under sticks, you catch more sticks. There we go. Oh boy. I'm in trouble.
That looked like a nice fish.
It was a big fish.
What happened, man?
Big fish, 7X, and a tree. Bad combination. Another one up in that riffle. So we walked, I fished through all this flatter water below. Didn't catch one or even really see one. But you can see they're up in this water type with the warming temperatures of the morning. And there we go. And the funny thing is, a couple of guys walked right through here about an hour ago. And I mentioned to Connor that they were doing a good job standing where they should be fishing, because they would have stepped just about on top of where that fish was. Tucked up tight on the bank, right where he should be. Took a few tries, but at least it ended in the correct result. Another chunky little brown trout. See you later, buddy. Thanks for watching this tactical fly fisher tutorial. I hope you got something out of it and that it leads to a few more fish for you. While you're at it, if you liked it, give us a like. Give us that thumbs up on YouTube and subscribe to the channel, and we'll do our best to keep content coming that helps you out on the water. And please come on over to tacticalflyfisher.com, and we'll give you some fly tying goodies and some fly fishing goodies that also supply your obsession. Thanks for watching.